I've grown very fond of this class, getting to know you better than I know most classes through the journals, which have been so interesting and so thoughtful and in good ways kind of revealing of who you are. So I do want to express that. Before I go any further, I have to make an apology to you. I told you that I hope to give you my famous last lecture on the meaning of life, which I've given over the years at the end of this course since sometime in the 70s. If I could find the notes. Well, I know where in my file cabinet the notes are supposed to be. And I went there and they weren't. And I tried a few other places and they weren't there either. So we're going to have to do without. And I'm sorry about that, because it means you may have to work out the meaning of life on your own. And of course, there's a joke lurking here. So it's true, I really do have notes and I really couldn't find them. But it's no joke that people find it all too easy to lose track of the meaning of life. And when they lose track of the meaning of life, as you probably know, it can be fatal. Terrifying. In any case, even if I had the notes, they wouldn't help a whole lot because you would have to work it out on your own anyway, probably. I brought in something for show and tell. I carry this around in case I need to brush my remaining hair. This was manufactured and marketed and probably advertised for a purpose, right? It's for brushing hair. And there's no question what the purpose of this is, though I could repurpose it if I wished, but it was made for a purpose, sold for a purpose, bought for a purpose. And it doesn't have any say in the matter. You, on the other hand, were not produced by a factory and marketed and bought for a purpose over which you have no say. You're a very different kind of being from that. I think that's important to remember that you are. And even if you fervently believe that you were created by a creator God with a purpose, you probably also believe that that purpose involves choice on your part and freedom. Essentially, you are not to the God you believe in as that brush comb arrangement is to the factory that made it, right? I hope that's perfectly clear. And you didn't come into the world with operating instructions. In searching around, I did find, actually folded into a book, some notes that are marked LL, which stands for last lecture. And they're from May 2nd, 2003. And they're about Socrates. So I hope that's okay. You know, Socrates' death blew through the intellectual world like a typhoon and changed everything. Everything after Socrates in the world of thought and philosophy was different, because Socrates made philosophy so much about not fearing death. Death became a major theme in philosophy after Socrates. He died calmly, as you know, without protest, as if he knew that his death was not a big deal, as if he knew that he couldn't know what would come next. And this knowing, whatever it was that he knew, this knowing we have to understand in the context of a thinker who denies that he knows anything. He doesn't have, he's very clear that he doesn't have the kind of how-to knowledge that would direct him to live a good life and allow him to teach other people how to live a good life. Instead of having that kind of how-to knowledge that would guide him and help him guide others, what he had was a sense of the vital importance of exploring what it is to live a good life. He saw, I think, that his soul depended not on staying alive in a living body, but in staying alive in not giving up the task which he had undertaken. It's a different kind of staying alive that was important to him. And in this, he gave philosophy its unique identity in the tradition that begins with the Greeks and made Socrates the icon. Of course, the Socrates we have is, to some extent, the creation of Plato. He's an extreme philosopher. He's not somebody we can actually emulate completely. But never mind that. He introduced into this tradition, the European tradition, the idea that philosophy is a discipline for keeping your soul alive and healthy against certain kinds of threats and dangers. So I have improved them a little bit. These are the notes from May 2nd, 2003. The threats to the health of the soul that Socrates sees would have been familiar to the Buddhists that we've been reading as well. Anger, desire, greed, ambition, and so on. And what Socrates saw as a healthy antidote to the dangers, again, somewhat similar to what we were reading about in the Buddhists when we read about the importance they place on wisdom, was, I think, consisted largely of two things. Socrates tries to maintain an independence from the general opinions of other people and from the consensus of Athens. He's not trying to accommodate himself to the standard values of his time. That was first point, independence, thinking for himself. And related to that, what I'm calling conscience, he doesn't have that word, but it means, I think, for him, a combination of self-knowledge with a devotion to the good, and his goal is to keep both his independence and his conscience alive and awake through a method that you've observed of questioning. The Greek word is elenchus. By ceaselessly and perhaps ruthlessly questioning himself and others, he meant to keep his soul awake, keep it independent, keep it tuned in to what he thinks are the highest values. And that made him stand out as different from the normal Athenian, as a rather strange person. And you remember at the beginning of the symposium, we're told he stood in a trance, having some kind of philosophical attack. Unlike anybody else, that Socrates could do that. So, what else did I say in 2003? I talked about the legacy of Socrates for other philosophical schools, and I'm going to leave that out because I'm more interested in the legacy for us, for all of us. He remains the iconic model of a man living the examined life through undying questioning that keeps his soul active and attuned to the highest values. And those values he speaks of in the Apology of Socrates again and again, when he blames the Athenians for caring too much about money and fame or reputation or public office, and not enough about what? Too much about money and fame, not enough about being attuned to the highest values, which are, of course, the virtues. But he doesn't tell us what those are, and I think he makes it fairly clear that he's not in a position to give you definitive answers to questions like what is courage, what is wisdom, what is justice. And when people like Euthyphro try to give determinate answers to the question, what is reverence, what is piety, he shows that they don't know what they're talking about. But what good is it for Socrates to tell me I should not care about money or fame, but instead care about something he can't tell me what it is? What's the point of that? Well, part of the point of it is, as you know, Socrates is the teacher who teaches without teaching. There's a Wu Wei idea there that you may recognize. Act without acting, teach without teaching. Socrates is in no position, and he knows in no position, to tell you exactly what courage requires, or justice, or reverence. Instead, he's got something else going for him. He does believe that we are all naturally somehow attuned to what is really good and good for us. And here's the important point I wanted to make about Socrates, which I rediscovered by reading these notes from 2003. Where Socrates thinks the God, or the gods, or anyone with a divine mind would know what the virtues are and live accordingly, The human soul is in a different position. Remember, again from the Apology, the one thing Socrates knows is that he lacks wisdom. But there's a lot packed into that. Right? There's a tremendous amount packed into that. You have to know quite a bit to know that you don't have wisdom. Right? You have to know something about wisdom to even get started on that one. Where the divine mind has knowledge, the human mind can have love, inflamed by a powerful intuition of an absent beauty. If the soul is properly awakened by questioning, Socrates' questioning, it becomes aware of the pull of something that it doesn't perfectly grasp. A powerful intuition of an absent beauty. I like that phrase. I found it in these 2003 notes. Yeah, so, powerful intuition of an absent beauty. There's something very attractive that's pulling at the soul, and you don't know exactly what it is, but you know it's good, and you are working towards getting closer and closer to it. It leads to a passionate devotion. And to those who don't understand what's going on, it may seem like absolute madness. And in the dialogue, we didn't read the Phaedrus. Socrates does talk about how love does appear to those who don't understand it as a kind of insanity. Let me see if I can do without this. There. So, Socrates, as of 2003, those I think were very helpful. What do they have to do, or do they have anything to do with the meaning of life? I chose these notes because, as I say, I found them folded in a book, and they were marked LL, which stands for last lecture. So I must have used them in connection with this kind of lecture back in 2003. What Socrates finds most clearly is his limitations, his principal limitations. And the limitations of a human being by being human to the ancient Greek mind are, first of all, ignorance. The gods have knowledge, human beings don't. And second of all, death. The gods are immortal, and human beings are not. We are mortal. Death and ignorance are our fundamental human limitations from which we cannot escape. Do they have anything at all to do with the meaning of life? They plainly have a lot to do with Socrates' mission. None of us, I think, are quite able to take up Socrates' mission. But still, I think they are clues to what we should be thinking about. The wonderful value of recognizing your ignorance is that it gives you something to work on all your life. And as I have said before, one of the beautiful things about philosophy, at least as I understand it, is that philosophy centers on really good, solid questions that are not going to be ruined by anybody giving them answers. Right? They're going to be there. Those questions have been around for thousands of years. They'll last your lifetime. Don't worry. They'll be there when you're my age. You don't have to fear that they will go away. This ignorance is something to work on. Good questions last. And having a good sense of what the important questions are, I think, can be an important part of finding meaning in your life. And about death, I think it's pretty obvious. Death is a reason to make every minute count. You don't know how long you have. So there is, in this Socratic approach, at least a partial answer to the question about the meaning of life, that you can give meaning to your life by recognizing these human limitations and taking them in a positive spirit, so that ignorance is something you work on. And death is not so much a thing to fear as it is a reason to live well while you can. There's much more to say about this, and luckily I'm not done, because, as you know, for me, the war Plato declares between philosophy and poetry is a war that has drawn me in on both sides all my life. And I have assembled a few poems for you. More than a few poems, a lot of poems. Let's see. Will somebody, thank you, Josie Ann. Yes. Yeah, there should be enough for everyone here. I wanted to say, first of all, about the meaning of life question. I told you Tuesday, this question hit me very hard when I came back from Vietnam, and I didn't know who I was or why I'd survived or what the point was of anything. And I went through a very rough patch until I spent about a month alone in the Maine woods finishing a play I was writing. And somehow, through contact with nature and through this act of creativity, recovered enough that I was able, with her help, to reestablish my relationship with my girlfriend. A lot of help from her. Many veterans come back and are unable to maintain relationships, but thanks to her, I did. The question, what is the meaning of life, is not a normal question. This morning, you didn't lie in bed waiting to work out an answer before you got up. I had a friend who did that for 2 or 3 weeks. He couldn't figure out the meaning of life, and so he just stayed in bed. It didn't work very well for him. And that's not normal, right? It's abnormal conditions that raise the question. And here are some of them. You might have an absolutely meaningless job. There's a famous story by Melville Bartleby the Scrivener about a man who has a meaningless job. He's a human Xerox machine, copies out insurance policies, or rather legal documents. and finds his life so meaningless that he stops eating and dies. Famous poem that I'm going to refer to more than once by Tennyson imagines that Ulysses, or Odysseus, has come home to Ithaca, where after a life of adventure, he is bored stiff. How dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in youth, as though to breathe were life, life piled on life were all too little, and of one, to me, little remains. But every hour is saved from that eternal silence, something more, a bringer of new things, and vile it were for some 3 suns to store and hoard myself, and this gray spirit yearning in desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. Ulysses, as Tennyson imagines him, is not going to put up with that kind of retirement on Ithaca. He's got another adventure in mind, and you'll see, I quote more of him later on. I'll quote more of him later on this afternoon. He will push out, he will set out again in his boat with his friends. Closer to you is graduation. Luckily, you are sophomores, and you won't be driven from this paradise of Plan 2 with a flaming sword for another 2 years, most of you. But it will happen. And then what? Plan 2 and UT have between them nicely foisted meetings on your days, and you've known what you were to do day after day, pretty much. But as I say, the flaming sword will come, and you'll be out. And then what? There's a wonderful sonnet by Milton, which I have not memorized. He wrote it when he turned 23 and had no idea what to do with his life. How soon hath time, the subtle thief of youth, stolen on his wing my 23 year. My hasting days flies on with full career, but my late spring no bud or blossom showeth. At 23, it's actually a bit young to have blossoms. Most people, John Keats was blossoming at 23, but most of you won't be. Most of us are not. So don't worry about it, but Milton was worried. Perhaps my semblance might deceive the truth, that I to manhood am arrived so near, and inward ripeness doth much less appear, that some more timely happy spirits endueth. Yet it be less or more, or soon or slow, it shall be still, in strictest measure even, to that same lot, however mean or high, toward which time leads me, and the will of heaven. All is, if I have grace to use it so, as ever in my great taskmaster's eye. So he's waiting for God to tell him what to do with his life. Not the best strategy, nor the best theology, in my view. And I think he came up with a better idea later. I'll be quoting more Milton right now. Here's a bit. In the middle of the 1600s, as you probably know, England underwent a civil war. And the Protestants with whom Milton sided took over the government and drove out many of the aristocrats and the monarchy. And Milton wanted to be part of this, but he was blind and unable to do anything much on behalf of the revolutionary government. And that saved his life and saved English poetry from a tremendous loss, because had he been actively engaged in the Civil War, he would have been a dead man when it ended. He almost was a dead man as it was. He wrote this sonnet on his blindness. And I was taught this sonnet by my mother many years ago, and then when she lost her sight, she'd forgotten about it. But I think it gave her some comfort when I brought it back to her. When I consider how my light is spent, that's his way of saying when I consider how I'm blind now, ere half my days in this dark world and wide, and that one talent which is death to hide, lodged with me useless, though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker and present my true account. You know the parable of the talents? Yes, Josiane does. I'm not sure anybody else does. The master leaves, goes on a trip, and I think there are 3 servants. He leaves one of them with, I guess, a talent is quite a lot of money, 5 talents, and one with 2 and one with 1. And the man who gets 5 talents invests it and makes a fortune, which he then is prepared to present to his master when the master reappears. The one who got only 1 talent buried it and has nothing but that talent when the master comes back. You see what it means, right? This is a religious parable. That one talent which is death to hide, lodged in me useless, though my soul more bent to serve there with my Maker and present my true account, lest he returning chide. Doth God exact day labor, light deny? Does God want me to do any work for him now that I'm blind? I fondly ask. But patience, to prevent that murmur, soon replies, and this is wonderful, I think. God doth not need either man's work or his own gifts. Who best bear his mild yoke, they serve him best. His state is kingly. Thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. Thousands at his bidding speed, and post o'er land and ocean without rest. They also serve who only stand and wait. One night when I was on call for what we called hunter-killer, which was a helicopter operation that we would launch in support if any part of the province were under attack, which didn't happen every night, but happened often enough. And I told the duty officer, remember, they also serve who only stand and wait. He had no idea what I was talking about. He didn't know Milton. He was an engineer, but not a Plan 2 engineer, I guess. And truly, he didn't understand it because about 3 a.m, he did call me, and I had to go up in the chopper to try to support our troops in a horrible operation. So these are conditions that might make you question the meaning of your life. Retirement, graduation, illness, and death. Maxine Kumin, a wonderful poet, has a collection of poets with this title, Our Ground Time Here Will Be Short. You've heard that on an airplane, no doubt. Plane lands and is about to take off again. Our ground time here will be short. Keep that in mind. And Tennyson, in Ulysses, has these wonderful 3 lines. Death closes all, but something ere the end. Some work of noble note may yet be done, not unbecoming men that strove with gods. So Tennyson. And there's more. I'll give you more Tennyson in a moment. Death is not the worst thing that might happen to you. Undeath might even be worse. And here I'm thinking of the myth of Tithonus. Tithonus was a beautiful youth who slept, I guess, in the open. And dawn, when she rose in the morning, traveling from east to west, would look down and see Tithonus lying asleep and fell madly in love with him because he was so gorgeous. And so she went to Zeus and begged that Tithonus could be made immortal and she would be allowed to marry him. And Zeus nodded, which means yes. And Tithonus was made immortal. But the goddess of dawn forgot to ask for the other thing, which was immortal youth, eternal youth. Tithonus was immortal. What it meant was he would age and age and age forever. I think that's worse than dying. Probably. Although I don't mind aging, it's a good thing. I know it has an end. And as you age, you may have noticed with your grandparents that you shrink. I'm quite a bit smaller than I was 10 years ago already. So Tithonus went on shrinking and shrinking and shrinking and shrinking until he was so small that dawn was able to keep him in the shell of a cicada, according to the myth. You know, little critter about that big that comes out of its shell, actually leaves shells. It's a wonderful animal, spends many, many years underground and comes up and has a short breeding life. So she kept him in the golden shell of a cicada, and she could put the shell to her ear and hear him singing. You know, the great love poet Sappho wrote a poem about this, which has recently been reconstructed from papyri. And here's my translation, in which I try to reproduce actually the Greek meter. What you hear here is very much like the Greek in the rhythm. Lie in the lap of the sweet muse, girls. Learn how to chirp out a clear song, boys. I have been ambushed by cold old age. This is the poet singing. I have been ambushed by cold old age, seen the dark hair on my head turn white. Heavy at heart, I walk weak-kneed. I who once danced like a bright young deer. Grief is my partner, but what good's that? When has a woman or a man not aged? Think of Tithonus, the boy dawn took far to the east in her rose-pink arms. She was in love with his soon lost youth. But all that remains is his clear, frail voice. It's a wonderful poem for a poet to have written. Sappho is gone, but her voice does remain in poems like this. So these are all poems about why, that bring out why we might question the meaning of our lives, what we're looking for, that we feel we need in these harsh circumstances. So now I turn to poets who point us towards answers. Here's a poem by Mary Oliver about a grasshopper, which is something like a cicada, but not the same. It's called The Summer Day. Who made the world? Who made the swan and the black bear? Who made the grasshopper? This grasshopper, I mean, the one who flung herself out of the grass, the one who is eating sugar out of my hand, who is moving her jaws back and forth instead of up and down, who is gazing around with her enormous and complicated eyes. I like that. Now she lifts her pale forearms and thoroughly washes her face. Now she snaps her wings open and floats away. I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention, how to fall down into the grass, how to kneel down in the grass, how to be idle and blessed, how to stroll through the fields, which is what I have been doing all day. Tell me, what else should I have done? Doesn't everything die at last and too soon? Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life? I don't know exactly what a prayer is. I do know how to pay attention. Paying attention, of course, is one of the ways of finding and making meaning in your life. Noticing such simple things as the grasshopper washing his face. And the things you pay attention to that give meaning to your life don't have to be conventionally beautiful. It might be the iridescence of light reflected on water in a pothole that has been polluted with oil. It could still be gorgeous. It might be a mosquito that has just landed on your arm. The mosquito is a beautiful creature when you think about it. So delicate. You don't agree. It is. Pay attention. But then there's beauty as well. She's not emphasizing the beauty of the grasshopper, but there's beauty to be seen and attended to. Keats wrote an epic poem on Endymion, whose story is actually somewhat similar to that of Tithonus. It was a failure as a poem, and it almost ruined his life. In fact, he thought it had ruined his life. But the prologue is unforgettably beautiful. A thing of beauty is a joy forever. Its loveliness increases, it will never pass into nothingness, but still will keep a bower quiet for us, and a sleep full of sweet dreams and health and quiet breathing. Therefore, on every morrow are we wreathing a flowery band to bind us to this earth, spite of despondence, of the inhuman dearth of noble natures, of the gloomy days, of all the unhealthy and o'er-darkened ways made for our searching. Yes, in spite of all, some shape of beauty moves away the pall from our dark spirits. This is worth a lot of attention, this bit of poetry. He's fully aware of all the things to be miserable about: despondence, the inhuman dearth of noble natures. Just look at American politics for the inhuman dearth of noble natures. The gloomy days, all the unhealthy and o'er-darkened ways made for our searching. Yes, in spite of all, some shape of beauty moves away the pall from our dark spirits. And this lovely image, a thing of beauty is a joy forever. Therefore, on every morrow are we wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth. Therefore, on every morrow are we wreathing a flowery band to bind us to the earth. That's how Keats kept his life meaningful. Every day, wreathing a flowery band to bind him to the earth. I imagine he wrote some poetry almost every day. Making beauty, seeing beauty, of course, adds meaning to life. Then there's the search for knowledge I mentioned earlier in connection with Socrates. And, of course, Tennyson says it beautifully. Tennyson, I don't think, was the most intelligent poet of his day, but he wrote the best word music. Word music. His poetry is wonderful to the ear. And he did have, I think, an understanding of life that many other poets did not. He was, we might say, neurologically divergent, as was his brother. He was subject to depression. His brother had to be institutionalized for depression. This gray spirit, yearning and desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star beyond the utmost bound of human thought. What a great idea. So, Tennyson, as Ulysses, refused to accept a dull and meaningless life on Ithaca and set out on further adventures. They might, as Tennyson suggests, be adventures of the mind, the great spirit yearning and desire to follow knowledge like a sinking star. But he wants to explore. He wants to cross the ocean. And so Tennyson's great poem on Ulysses ends this way. The lights begin to twinkle from the rocks, the long day wanes, the slow moon climbs, the deep moans round with many voices. Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world. Push off and sitting well in order, smite the sounding furrows. For my purpose holds, my purpose, he's got a purpose. My purpose holds to sail beyond the sunset and the baths of all the western stars until I die. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles. The happy isles are islands where the most blessed of the dead go in Greek mythology. And Tennyson himself, when he recited this poem, apparently could not recite the next line without bursting into tears. He wrote this poem and his other great poem, In Memoriam, about the death of a dear friend, Arthur Hallam. It may be that the gulfs will wash us down. It may be we shall touch the happy isles and see the great Achilles, whom we knew. Though much is taken, much abides, and though we are not now that strength which in old days moved earth and heaven, yet that which we are, we are. One equal temper of heroic hearts, made weak by time and fate, but strong in will, to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. Adventure. Not giving up, never giving up on adventure. Now you probably remember we spoke a little bit about Aristotle's ethics. We didn't read them this year. Aristotle thought the goal of a life should be an activity in accord with human excellence, i.e. virtue. And such a goal had to meet certain conditions. It had to be final, that is, it couldn't be valuable for anything else. It had to be intrinsically valuable, therefore not money. Money's only worth what you can buy with it. And it has to be distinctly human, and therefore not something, not some kind of life goal that we might share with other animals like sex. It has to make use of our higher capacities, I would say, as love does. It has to be up to us. It can't be something that depends on other people. It can't be fame, because whether you have fame or not depends on other people. It has to be something that is under our control. Our goals have to be under our control. And it has to fill a whole life. And a whole life varies in length. I mean, you might live 20 years or 100 years. But the goal that you're seeking in whatever many years you have has to be one that fits that amount of time. What kind of goal can fit any amount of time? Well, we talked earlier, you may remember this, about the difference between, say, an action and an activity. There's an important distinction that Aristotle makes. And I gave this example, I'll give it again. Suppose I set out on my bicycle to go down to the store and buy a shiner, Bach. And before I get to the store, I have an unfortunate encounter with a city bus. And you say, poor Paul. He set out to get a shiner, Bach, and he set out to get a shiner Bach, and he never made it. Somewhere in here is that noisemaker. There. Now suppose I set out on the bike again in the same direction, but this time I'm not setting out to get a shiner Bach. I'm setting out to go for a bike ride. And I have the same encounter with the same gruesome result. But now you can say, lucky Paul, he got a bike ride before the end. You see the difference? There's a difference between an action that is only completed when after a certain time or distance, when it meets a certain criterion, and an activity that, as Aristotle says, is complete at any point. Does that make sense? It's a wonderful distinction, it seems to me. So if you live your life, as Aristotle says, as an activity, then it's always complete. So the goal of a life, according to Aristotle, the goal that one can reasonably have as a human being, has to be intrinsically good, which means it can't be money. It has to be something over which you have control, which means it can't be fame. So we're right on in line with Socrates here, right? And it has to be something that uses your distinctly human capacities. You know, I would say not just your reason, but your powerful emotional facilities, which I think Socrates did appreciate. Love. Can't say too much about that. And it has to fill your life, whatever length your life has, and be an activity. So what gives meaning to a life from an Aristotelian point of view, which I think is very helpful, has to meet these conditions for a human life, for your life. And I can say all this without defining the virtues or telling you exactly what this life is. Now, these are guidelines. Now, they're not instructions. In the beginning and in middle age, I think Milton seemed to foist the question of the meaning of his life onto his great taskmaster, God. They also serve who only stand and wait. All is as ever in my great taskmaster's eyes, he says. But I think at the end, Milton came to a much deeper wisdom. Luckily, he wasn't executed when the Civil War came to end and the monarchy was restored. Luckily, he had time to write one of the greatest poems in the English language, Paradise Lost. Paradise Lost is the whole story that begins with Satan's rebellion against God and ends with the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden. And that expulsion, by the way, is itself a kind of love story. When Adam realizes that Eve has eaten some of the apple and will therefore be expelled from the garden, he knows he wants to go with her. And he eats of the apple too, so they can be together. So that is a love story. I can't recommend this poem too highly. The whole last book of the poem is, well, every part of the poem I think is beautiful. Here's just the end of it. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the flaming sword, right? They're expelled. They're looking back at the wall that protects Eden, and there are the fierce angels with the flaming sword. They, looking back, all the eastern side beheld of paradise, so late their happy seat, waved over by that flaming brand, the gate with dreadful faces thronged and fiery arms. Some natural tears they dropped, but wiped them soon. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest, and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. This is for you when you graduate. Remember this. The world was all before. The world will be all before you. The world was all before them, where to choose their place of rest and Providence their guide. They, hand in hand. That's important. They weren't alone. Hand in hand with wandering steps and slow, through Eden took their solitary way. And one more poem from the great American poet Walt Whitman, Leaves of Grass. I think I've read this at the end of many philosophy courses because it's written to be the last word in a philosophy course. And unfortunately, it's written for an age in which you would expect the audience in the philosophy course to be all male. We're better off now. Here it goes. And now, gentlemen, a word I give to remain in your memories and minds as base and finality for all metaphysics, so to the students, the old professor, at the close of his crowded course. Having studied the new and antique, the Greek and Germanic systems, Kant having studied and stated Fichte and Schelling and Hegel, stated the lore of Plato, and Socrates, greater than Plato and greater than Socrates, sought and stated Christ divine, having studied long. I see reminiscent today those Greek and Germanic systems, see the philosophies all, Christian churches and tenets see, yet underneath Socrates clearly see, and underneath Christ, the divine I see, the dear love of man for his comrade, the attraction of friend to friend, of the well-married husband and wife, of children and parents, of city for city, and land for land. The base and finale for all metaphysics, says Walt Whitman, is friendship. And certainly, friendship gives meaning to life. It gives us something to live for. I hope that, let me explain. There's a picture on the back of this. I wasn't quite sure whether to include it, and then I decided I should. This is my best friend and I, best friend aside from my married best friend, Reuben, who died a few years ago. Reuben was just a wonderful man. That friendship was enormously valuable to me, and I didn't realize how valuable it was to him until sometime towards the end of his life. We used to have breakfast every week, one place or another, and talk about things that were important to us. In one year, Reuben lost his mother, who lived well to be nearly 100. Still, at any age, losing a parent is hard. And he lost his wife, who died of an agonizingly painful kind of cancer. And he lost his leg through diabetes. That was a triple loss. And he was miserable. And he didn't tell me, he told my wife that if it hadn't been for our friendship and our weekly breakfasts, he wouldn't have been able to go on living. Friendships give meaning to life, and I have seen actually many wonderful friendships begin in this course over the years, and I try to make that happen. I'm not a matchmaker. You make your own matches, but you get to know people through the journal. You get to know people through the discussions and navigations, and it has seemed to me over the years that wonderful friendships have been formed that last. And I hope that's true in your case. Friendships can give meaning to lives. And all the other things that give meaning when we share them with friends give extra meaning. because of the friends. Knowing you these last 9 months has been very meaningful for me, and I'm grateful for that. So I want to end by thanking you for the connections that we have had since late August. So thank you all very much.